It's Thursday, and we are off. Thank you very much for joining me here on the show today. I've got author and veteran Phil Klay, the winner of the National Book Award. His new book, Uncertain Ground, Citizenship in an Age of Endless Invisible War. He weighs in on the horrific gun violence in Texas as well, because he wrote a chapter about that in his book, and really excited to introduce him to you if you're not familiar with Phil. I think you're going to love our conversation. And one of the Stand Up With Me Dominic All-Stars, your favorite historian and mine, Kenneth C. joins me to talk about Memorial Day, the history of that, and much, much more. So I hope that you are finding a way to deal and cope with the news out of Texas. I hope that you have been able to live your life and not be too affected and distracted by it. I'm sure that if you haven't, then you're like me. It's been really hard. Also, you may have had to have some tough conversations with your kids, as I have with my girls. I always do after these things happen. I always try to get to them first before they find out about it on TikTok or from their friends. And so we had good conversations about it, and it sucks. Just so terrible, because my daughter Julia was basically asking, does this ever happen is it possible that it could happen in my school? And what would I do? And these questions, they come up. It's just absolute sheer terror for these kids. And so it's tough, and you're not alone, and we'll talk about it tonight at the Hangout. I hope to see you there, 8 East. We had a great conversation about it Tuesday night as well on a Hangout, but I'll be hosting a Hangout tonight at 8 for all stand-up subscribers. If you're not a subscriber, please think about signing up now and joining our community. You will never be alone if you're part of the stand-up community. You can always join us in the Discord chat. You can just hang out, keep your camera off, and feel like you're part of our community on Thursday nights as well. So sign up now, standupwithpete.com. All right, so there's a few news stories I just wanted to mention to you, and like I said, we'll talk about the shooting tonight at the Hangout. I talk about it a little with my first guest, Phil Klay. Don't touch on it with Kenneth C. because, of course, he and I spoke before that happened. So I do want to just mention a few other news stories that are getting buried because of the horrific massacre in Texas. And that includes the top one I think probably should be getting a lot of attention is it's been 2 years since the murder of George Floyd at the hands of former police officer Derek Chauvin, and as other members of Minnesota law enforcement stood idly by. And on this terrible anniversary, you heard from several people acknowledging on social media, remembering to pay tribute to Floyd 2 years after his murder, including former President Barack Obama, who tweeted, "As we grieve the children of Uvalde, Texas today, we should take time to recognize that 2 years have passed since the murder of George Floyd under the knee of a police officer. His killing stays with us all to this day, especially those who loved him." Martin Luther King Jr.'s daughter, Bernice King, tweeted, "We are mourning. Black people sought and slaughtered in Buffalo. Children and teachers gunned down at a school in Uvalde. Persistent racism and gun violence throughout the nation. And today we remember George Floyd, who should be alive, raising his daughter." Gabrielle Giffords tweeted, "I'm sending love to George Floyd's family today. They are marking 2 years without a cherished father, son, and friend. The intersection of racism and violence is a crisis in our society. We must do more to address it." Senator Elizabeth Warren, "Today we remember George Floyd. I'm praying for his loved ones as they carry the weight of this anniversary. I'll keep working alongside activists for racial justice to pass the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, dismantle white supremacy, and end systemic racism." And finally, Amy Klobuchar, who is a senator from the state where George Floyd was killed and lived, Minnesota, she writes on Twitter, "George Floyd should be alive today, but every day that he isn't is a reminder of the work we have to do. Today we lift up George Floyd's memory as the man who inspires us to confront systemic racism with systemic change. Let's honor his life by fighting for justice." And I highly recommend that you get the book that I interviewed one of the authors, Toulouse Olorunipa, on, I don't know what day it was this week. His new book, all about George Floyd. His name is George Floyd. One Man's Life, The Struggle for Racial Justice, is out now. And very few Americans have done more in recent years to fight for racial justice than former NFL football star Colin Kaepernick. And now, apparently, he's getting his first chance to work out again with an NFL team since last playing the league in 2016. How about that? He's getting a chance, apparently, to work out with the Las Vegas Raiders on Wednesday. So that's pretty interesting news. and I highly recommend it. It's such a really important book. In other news, 1 in 5 adults now under 65 who recovered from COVID in the U.S. has experienced long COVID. Among patients 65 and older, the number is even higher, 1 in 4, according to the study, based on medical records for nearly 2 million people. Post-COVID patients 65 and older were at greater risk than the younger group of developing kidney failure, neurological problems, and most mental health conditions. The president of Ukraine is dismissing suggestions that Ukraine should cede control of areas occupied by Russian forces for the sake of peace agreement. He's also asking for more military assistance from the West, so basically telling Henry Kissinger and everybody else to go fuck themselves. Good for him. The Congressional Budget Office says that high inflation is going to persist into next year, likely causing the federal government to pay higher interest rates on its debt. So that's terrible. Certainly for the midterm elections and obviously for people's bottom lines. And this story, a brood of 9 mallard ducklings that fell down a sewer near U.S. Capitol were rescued Wednesday by ground staff who used long poles with nets to scoop the baby ducks and lift them to safety. So I think that's a good news story to end on. All right, just a few things I wanted to mention. Still playing around with the opening. Really excited about some things that we're going to do. Talk to him. I hope to talk to you more about that tonight at the Hangout if you're a listener and subscriber. And thank you to everybody who has signed up with new subscriptions or even started paying more, which you can always do. I really can't thank you guys enough. I was so worried about losing subscriptions and still am as a result of not doing this big, long news update. But the feedback has been overwhelming. Please keep it coming. And I'm going to take a lot of time, a couple hours Friday, to try to return those emails that so many of you have sent me. standupwithpete@gmail.com. Now time to get to my first guest. He is an author and a combat veteran of the U.S. Marine Corps. He's the author of Redeployment, which won the 2014 National Book Award for Fiction, and Missionaries, which was named one of the 10 best books of 2020 by the Wall Street Journal. His writings appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Atlantic, and elsewhere. He also teaches fiction at Fairfield University and is a council member for the arts in the armed forces. This book is really, really good. It's a series of essays that cover so many different subjects related to America's wars, those who served in them, how they affect all of us here back at home, and certainly those in the countries where we fought. I really like this guy. I really like this book. I was very excited to have him on for the first time. Uncertain Ground, Citizenship in an Age of Endless Invisible War. Ladies and gentlemen, my conversation with Phil Klay. Phil, thank you so much for joining me, and congratulations on this, your third book, if I have it right.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me on. It's great. I've been a fan. So
yeah. Well, I've had the great opportunity to talk to a lot of veterans and military experts over the years, and my favorite ones, of course, to talk to, frankly, are those who are the best at expressing their experience in the military, in conflict. And so the writers. And so you're friends with Matt Gallagher, who, of course, I've talked to many times. There's a whole, obviously, generation of veterans who also happen to be great writers. So what do you think? What do you think about other veterans? Why do veterans of U.S. wars or any other write so well? Or why do they write?
Because when you go to war, I think it forces you to reevaluate a lot of things, right? There's Judith Herman, who's a psychologist, talks about sort of this in terms of trauma, right? Where trauma forces the individual to become their own judge, their own philosopher, and their own priest, right? Because the way that you thought the world worked all of a sudden doesn't seem to work that way anymore. The ideas that you had about, the sort of simple morality that used to, operate according to that, you all of a sudden you've been faced with complex human situations that you need to reevaluate. And your sense of, your man's place in the universe all of a sudden gets shifted. Then you have to build that up on your own with other people. And then on top of that, there's this sort of like, you come back to America and you're like, what is this place, right? Like, I went to something that was really important, and the things that are happening there, right, feel totally disconnected from what's happening here in America, right? And yet the decisions that we're making here absolutely determine what happens over at war. And so you're forced to really grapple with America, what it means, what your role in it is, what it means to be a citizen, what it means to be at war, especially to be at war for so long. And that means you really have to work on communicating that, right? And so there's this great tradition of veterans not only talking about war, but talking about America, right? And the kind of ideas and values that America used to send them to war and to welcome veterans home or to fail to.
It's all well said. You're as good at talking as you are at writing. That's not always the case, you know? It's not always the case. Sometimes you go to interview a great writer and they just can't get it out. And like, well, you got no time. We're in an interview. This is a podcast, sir.
Yeah.
This book is obviously a lot different from your previous work. What is the impetus for Uncertain Ground: Citizenship in an Age of Endless Invisible War?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, my works of fiction are attempting to kind of draw the reader in, to get them to imagine these experiences from the inside. I think these are essays that are much more directly inviting the reader into an argument, an ongoing argument, as part of them having with myself about American history, about American war, about American citizenship and our role in it. It's just a weird place that we're in because we've been at war for a long, long time. Right. And we're still engaged all over the world. I know that Joe Biden spoke before the UN and claimed that we weren't at war. And yet, despite that, we're still killing people fairly regularly in Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen, in Pakistan, in Libya. It was just reported in the beginning of this month that Biden was sending more troops over to Somalia to continue a targeted killing campaign. And so how do we think about that? What should we do, especially when these sorts of decisions can be made without Congress voting on anything and without a lot of transparency? And also, how does that sort of extended period of warfare, which I think has been marked by a lot of grave failures of policy, sort of lack of seriousness, and which is, I think, infected our political culture, right? Mm-hmm. And contributed to the sense of frustration and lack of belief in those who guide us, and also kind of desire for a sort of moral purpose that feels so thwarted.
Yeah, I would only add one thing just to get you to respond to it in terms of our generation wars and conflicts, and that was your response to the criticism of hubris.
Yeah.
I'll come fix your house. Let me go. I'm awesome at fixing houses.
It is astonishing. Just a perfect example of that is...
Hey, it's going to be hard for you to fix this house if you don't speak Pashto. I'll get a guy. I got a guy. He's in them. Sorry, Phil.
Donald Rumsfeld, the guy who declared that the war was going to last 8 days, 8 weeks, 8 months, but no longer than that. After he left, after he'd been fired, right? We're even, after the unbelievable failures of his, leadership as Secretary of Defense, he put out a book of leadership tips.
Yeah, tough. It's tough.
Who wants Donald Rumsfeld's leadership tips?
The same people who want my hair care book.
Yeah. Yeah.
So hubris, I think that that's a huge part of it. And I think that, you can speak to that as a veteran, as a man, and as an American. However, Phil, you and I will forever be tied to the fact that I'm interviewing you for your new book, and you'll forever be tied to promoting your new book the day after the second worst, I think it's fair to say, mass shooting in American history, where almost 20 children were killed in Texas. And that'll, I wanted this interview to be about your book and to be kind of evergreen, but we're talking the day after that. I want to be transparent about that. Mm-hmm. And more importantly, you have a chapter in your book titled A History of Violence: How Firearms Have Grown More Deadly, One Innovation at a Time. And it's thoughtful, as is all of your work. It's nuanced, and there's so much here. So I guess, what do you want to say today as it corresponds to this chapter and to your life as an American and a combat veteran?
Yeah, that was one of the essays that I wrote that you write an essay about guns and about mass shootings in some part. It's the sort of essay that you never want to be relevant, and yet it feels like it keeps becoming relevant. It starts with America's first convicted murderer who came on the Mayflower and whose weapon of choice was a gun, right? And it talks about the gun that he had, which was incredibly rudimentary by our standards, right? Or, really he had one shot at his victim and then the guy could have, run away if he hadn't hit him because you had to, this complicated reloading process versus the kind of weaponry that we have today. The Las Vegas shooter over the course of 10 minutes unloaded 1,100 rounds, killed 58 people and wounded 422. That's a totally different type of thing. And along with the technological development, there's been a kind of development in how guns have marketed, right? So Samuel Colt, this famous innovator of automatic fire, right? The ability to keep putting rounds down range. One of his most important innovations was not in terms of the technology of the gun itself, but how you sell it. Because at the time, even though we like to imagine that America and the Old West was just saturated with guns, that wasn't really the case. There wasn't really a gun culture. During the Revolutionary War, we didn't have enough guns in the country to fight. It was a problem. And a lot of the guns that people had were, in ill use or not particularly good shape. And when Colt sold, I think it was 10,000 weapons to the state of Texas, it saturated the market, right? Which is kind of amazing to think about now. If you think about how many guns are probably sold just in the state of Texas today, that 10,000 guns in the 1800s could have saturated the market. And he knew he had to grow a civilian market. And so he was a real innovator, new and improved. That's a Samuel Colt thing. But also he started doing predicament advertising, right? So, somebody's under threat from animals or savages, right? And they're defending themselves with a gun. And after the Civil War, one of the marketing campaigns was that, Abraham Lincoln kept all men free, but Sam Colt made them equal, right? This idea that like American ideals of freedom and equality, they're not tied to civic engagement and political life. They're tied to your ability to kill somebody. And that kind of advertising, that kind of idea was very powerful for gun manufacturers, and I sort of trace that evolution. And then what you have in the 1980s and the 1990s, you have the kind of crime wave, and advertising about crime and the threat of crime becomes really important. But as the crime goes off, the sales of guns go off, and then you have the war on terror, and that opens up a new opportunity for scaring people into buying firearms, right? And especially during Barack Obama's presidency, you have the Barack boom, right? Where this massive explosion in gun sales, and the NRA is claiming that Latin American drug gangs have invaded every city of significant size in the United States, and they've got a special issue of their magazine with an ISIS fighter on the cover saying a dangerous world is closing in, and so this sort of amping up fears of immigration and crime and terrorism all get sort of tied together with marketing that is saying that, a gun is how you are free. A gun is how you ensure equality. A gun is how you be an American citizen. And it's a pretty toxic brew. A gun is how you be a man, right? And, that kind of, I talk about the hardware of the guns, right? Which makes them so incredibly lethal, so utterly unlike anything that we had during the colonial period, the Revolutionary War period. And then there's the kind of the software of the guns, these kind of messages that gun manufacturers have developed over 200 years to get us to think about guns as more than just an object, more than just a tool, but something deeply a part of us. And I think that it's incredibly unhealthy, So whenever I see these mass shootings, right, it's first and foremost, it's just unbelievably awful, right? But there's always this, what is the shooter's ideology, right? And sometimes they have different forms of crazy political beliefs. But I think there's also what is the general culture about guns and what they...
Well, let me ask you specifically about one thing there, in that certainly the vast majority of the gun violence is committed by men. Mm-hmm. What does your experience in the military as an American man, your relationship with your own firearms, those other men, emotional issues that we all have, and the idea of American masculinity. I mean, you write about this in all different kinds of ways. How much of the problem is the men that we are told that we are supposed to be, I guess?
Yeah, I think that's certainly a part of it, right? I think that, images of war and masculinity have always gone together. I think it's one of the reasons that sometimes people feel almost like threatened by women in the military, and find it difficult to reconcile that. There was this very sort of, it's not funny because it's, I think, a very dangerous trend, but, Russia would put out these advertising, videos of like extremely, ridiculously masculine, military
caricatures of,
and then you'd have conservative politicians like Ted Cruz being like, Russia's being, very manly while, we're having transgender people in the military. And turns out that just like, a lot of like blowhard, idiotic masculinity doesn't make you good at war, unsurprisingly.
Yeah, that's for sure. Let's talk about soldiers. The first section of your new book, which is so good, has several different essays about them. But I wanted to specifically ask you about the chapter titled, "We Have No Idea What We're Doing in Iraq. We Didn't Before We Killed Soleimani." Of course, he was Iranian. There's so much in here, and you've written about this a lot, this idea for the individual member of the military not knowing what they're there to fight for other than the guy next to him, right, much less the larger sense of the mission from the leaders who support it. Where does the confusion lie, and why, and how the hell do we get there?
Well, partly is it our presidents are not forced to advocate for and justify their policies because Congress doesn't vote on them. Congress is not really, we're still operating on the same authorization for the use of military force that we passed in 2001. That's what's underwriting our current action in Somalia, right? Which it was never intended to be. And so war making has been entirely ceded to the executive, which for a whole variety of reasons, but some of them sort of nakedly political, prefers to keep these things as out of the public view as possible, except when they want to take credit for things like the Soleimani strike. And so you don't have a situation where the president has to regularly come before Congress and explain where we're going to send troops to kill people, why, how it's in the national interest, what it's going to cost, what success is supposed to look like, right? What the benchmarks of success are going to be so that we can actually hold them accountable. Instead, we're heavily reliant on special operations troops, on drone strikes, on airstrikes, on mercenaries, right? All aspects of American military power that mostly happen out of sight. And that's not a good strategy for long-term success, nor is it, I think, healthy in a republic where, look, war is one of the most serious, morally fraught things that we do as a country. And there should be a lot more democratic accountability. And if there were, it's not just that it would be good for us as a country. It's not just that it might be good for our military policy, but it would be good for the individual soldier who would then feel that average Americans were taking up some of the stake in the wars and some of the responsibilities of citizenship, and certainly that members of Congress were doing so.
I hate to let you go. Last question. And the last section of your book is titled Faith. Just tell me briefly, if you will, about your own relationship with your own faith. And I'm particularly most fascinated with the second to last chapter. I won't give away the conclusion, which is, I think, the most important part of your book, America's Purpose After the Fall of Kabul. But you write, the question is, can the trauma of war lead to growth despite the scars? And you refer to history, you refer to philosophy and psychology there and throughout the book. But your faith and the answer to that question, if you want.
Yeah, I sort of, I was raised a Catholic. I sort of fell away from Catholicism while I was in Iraq, and then came back to it as I was kind of grappling with these issues. And I think that war experience is, trying to work your way through it. You need to think about psychology. You need to think about morals and ethics, and have a somewhat philosophical temperament. But I also think there's a spiritual component to it that's extremely important. Karl Melantis, the Vietnam veteran, writes about this quite beautifully as well. And so yeah, trying to think about these wars, they make you think about your country. They make you think about what war is and what is revealed about human beings, but they also sort of, I think, push you to look inward and change, right? And that piece goes through a variety of figures who responded to war, from St. Ignatius to Ernst Jünger, and see what they tried to make of what happened, and what sort of their experiences in war helped spur them to do. Which can, lead in very positive directions and very negative ones.
Well, in your case, I want to believe, at least on the surface, it's led in the very positive direction that allows so many of the rest of us, the 99% of the rest of us that don't know what it's like, this generation for sure, families as well, to have fought in a war and all the aftermath. Uncertain ground is another great contribution by you. So you've taken your experience and done nothing, well, at least this is all I can tell, nothing but positive things with it. I really appreciate you joining me, man. It's awesome to talk to you, and I hope that we can talk again because I have so many more questions about your amazing life and books.
Thank you so much. I would love that.
All right, there he goes, Phil Klay. I would love it too. I hope you enjoyed that conversation, and I know you're gonna love my conversation. Always great with historian Kenneth C. Davis coming up. But first, quickly, I've got to tell you about Indeed.com, everybody. If you are looking to hire somebody for your firm, your company's next hire, and you know you want it to be someone who's really good at problem solving, thinks like an entrepreneur, shows up on time, and all the other things, you can find out everything about your next hire on Indeed.com. The thing you need help with, whatever it is, how to find them, easy. You need Indeed. Indeed is the hiring platform where you can attract, interview, and hire all in one place. So instead of spending hours on multiple job sites searching for candidates with the right skills, go to Indeed and check out their powerful hiring partner that can help you do it all. Find great talent faster through these time-saving tools that they offer, like Indeed Instant Match, assessments, and virtual interviews. And with Instant Match, over 80% of employers get quality candidates whose resumes on Indeed matches their job description the moment they sponsor a job, according to Indeed Data US. A lot of listeners using Indeed, finding great talent for their companies, their firms, and Indeed saves you headaches. So you should be one of them. You don't want a headache, do you? You don't want these problems. You want to interview virtually with no downloads, plugins, or purchases. You can do it all in one place with Indeed. And after you use Indeed's virtual interviews, most employers say it saves them days of hiring time. With Indeed's reliability assessment, they can even predict candidates' punctuality and work attendance. Even better, Indeed is the only job site where you can only pay for applications that meet your must-have requirements. Indeed, unbelievably powerful hiring partner delivering 4 times more hires than all the other job sites combined. Join more than 3 million businesses worldwide that use Indeed to hire great talent fast. Sign up for Indeed now and get a $75 credit toward your first sponsored job. Plus, earn up to $500 extra in sponsored job credits with Indeed's virtual interviews. Visit Indeed.com/standup to learn more. Do it now. Even if you don't want to hire someone, go over there and check it out. You're going to love it. Indeed.com/standup. Claim your credits at Indeed.com/standup. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. All right, folks. Well, now it's time to get to my second guest of today's show, and he is one of your favorites, the best-selling author of Don't Know Much About History and other books in the Don't Know Much series. For more than 30 years, Kenneth C. Davis has proven that Americans don't hate history, just the dull version they slept through in class. His approach is to refresh us on the subjects we should have learned in school. He does it by busting myths, setting the record straight, and making history human. If your school, library, or learning community would like to speak with my friend Kenneth C. Davis, you can go to don'tknowmuch.com to book him. He's got a new book coming out in November. You can pre-order now. Great short books. You're going to love it. His most recent book, Strongman, The Rise of 5 Dictators and Fall of Democracy. More deadly than war, both. Very, very relevant, unfortunately. And I'm very happy to have him join me. He's on Twitter at Kenneth C. Davis. Give it up right now. Here he comes. There he is. I've just told you all about the legend, and we were just talking, and it's 10 years ago, a little over 10 years ago that we first connected after I spent a couple weeks during the summer reading Don't Know Much About History. It changed my life and said, would be a dream for me to get this guy on the show. I guess that's when it was.
Well, and very appropriate to today's conversation, we first started talking many years ago about the Civil War and the myths about it, the mistaken impressions about it. And that was, 10 years ago before the real rage over statues and teaching how we teach history began in the past few years. But this is a subject that's gone very deep and been very, very misunderstood, misinterpreted, but mostly mistaught for not 10 years or 20 years, but for 150 years in this country. So it's a very deep-seated argument. And of course, when we talk about Memorial Day, we are talking about the Civil War. And I've always loved to talk about this holiday because to me, growing up as a kid in Mount Vernon, New York, just outside of New York City, Memorial Day was the big day on the calendar. Much more important in some ways than the 4th of July was, because that happened in the summertime. We were out of school.
Right.
But Memorial Day, which when I was a child always fell on May 30th, we'll talk about that. But it was the day that it wasn't a day off so much. It was the day that the entire community got together. So all of the schools marched, and they had bands that played in the Memorial Day parade. All of the Boy Scouts and the Cub Scouts marched. Local veterans groups marched. And, I am, my father is long gone, but I was the child of a World War II veteran. This was a very real and meaningful holiday to us.
Right.
And because we participated in it in a very local way, it was very deep for me as a kid. So, and I remember the vets coming into the schoolroom. They would come into the classroom just before Memorial Day, and they would sell those little paper poppies. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about.
I don't.
I still see. Used to be the VFW or the American Legion would sell these paper poppies as the symbol of Memorial Day. And I'll come back to that in a couple of minutes too, why the poppy is so significant. But I remember they would come into the classroom and you would have a quarter and you would buy one of those poppies. And that was, it was a really meaningful thing as a child. Of course, we celebrated Christmas and all the other holidays and Thanksgiving, historical holidays. But Memorial Day was particularly significant.
Is it true that you and your classmates boiled the poppies down and sold them for black tar heroin? Is that accurate?
We're first of all talking about paper poppies, so no, we couldn't do such a thing.
So you rolled them up. This was what year was this?
Well, I'm talking about my childhood, not my teenage years.
Well, let's get to
we won't go into rolling papers just today. Again, this is a sacred holiday. So
it is a sacred holiday, and so that's exactly what I wanted to make the point of. You, because of your age, being the son of a World War II veteran, and so people your generation thought about it one way. Me and my daughters think about it another way. I have no idea how my daughters think about it. I would love to say that we have some kind of traditional thing that recognizes it, but we're no better than any other garbage American, and we have everybody over, or we do a thing. But for me growing up, it was the Final Four for the NCAA lacrosse tournament, which I cared so much about. The point being, my generation and my daughter's generation don't see it the way you do, which is why your work is so important. Your generation does, right?
Yeah. So let me start with what it is, because, when I started talking and writing about this a long time ago, and historic holidays have always been meaningful, always fun, always important to talk about. But this one is more important because it is truly the most solemn day on the American national calendar. Most people do tend to see it as the kickoff to summertime. And I understand that. 3-day weekend, weather's getting hot. The rentals in the Hamptons start for those of us who can rent in the Hamptons, or, go into the Jersey Shore, or all those things that we think of as the beginning of summer. You can wear
Wow, that was a
again.
very northeastern central summer plan for my national audience. But go ahead.
Yeah, I'm showing my geographic bias here. But the point is that most people think of it as the kickoff to the summertime and sales. It's going to be, I don't know, swimsuit sales or, beach sales or whatever. This is the big weekend for that. And I understand that and I appreciate it. And I think that's a good thing to celebrate. But this is the most solemn day on the holiday calendar, because it is a day that specifically is meant to honor those who gave their lives in service to the country in wartime. Those who gave what Abraham Lincoln called very famously the last full measure of devotion in the Gettysburg Address. So it is. It's not a celebratory holiday, and it's not Veterans Day. I know everyone will say thank a veteran this holiday weekend, but Veterans Day, November 11th, is something different. It honors all those who served, whether they're living or dead, in all of our wars. But Memorial Day is specifically for those men and women who gave their lives in service to the country. It was born, we talked about the Civil War to start this off, so let me connect it back.
Yeah, why?
This holiday.
Do you think most people don't realize the connection between Memorial Day and the Civil War? Because you teach me every year, and I forget every year.
Well, that's why I keep talking about it every year. I would have thought, well, I taught everybody about this, 30 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago. But no, we have to keep coming back because it's easily forgotten. And it is so inundated by the media coverage of Memorial Day as the kickoff of the summertime. And I understand that. The traffic reports, the beach reports will become more interesting. Will there be fireworks or not? So this, I get that. But I do want people to understand the significance of this. And more important this year, and I've talked about this actually the last couple of years, is the significance of this holiday in terms of the nation's racial history.
Right.
And I know there are people who are going to say, oh, you can't make everything about race. But this holiday is in essence about race and slavery and that piece of our history that we like to not talk about too much, especially now. And we don't want to, there are places that wouldn't even allow me to say it in school. The Memorial Day was born out of the ashes of the Civil War. 4 years of fighting ends in 1865. More than 600,000 Americans have died. That number, by the way, some think is as high as 750,000. It was an enormous percent of the American population at the time, more than 2%. So we'd be talking about 7 million people dying if we had a war of that magnitude today, just to put it into some perspective. So there was no city or town or village in this country that existed at the time that wasn't really affected personally by what was going on in the Civil War for 4 years. And that's why if you drive around whatever part of the country you're in, north or south, defeated Southern Confederacy states, you often see the Civil War memorial in the center of town. It's certainly true in New England. The Civil War was the central event in our history for a very, very long time. It's one of the reasons I wrote a book just about the Civil War. Don't know much about the Civil War. Somewhere it's behind me. And it's the reason I came back and wrote In the Shadow of Liberty, that book about the importance of slavery in our history.
Yeah.
When the war was over, about 3 years later, there was a very prominent politician named General John Logan. He had been a Civil War general. He was a Republican senator from Illinois, very powerful Republican senator, but he was also the head of a fraternal organization called the Grand Army of the Republic. The Grand Army of the Republic was the American Legion, or the VFW of its day, and it was very Republican, and it was very powerful, and it was a political force. Logan, as the head of this ceremonial group, announced in 1868 that we will set aside May 30th as a day to go out to the cemetery and put fresh flowers on the graves of the fallen Union soldiers who had fallen in an attempt to end slavery for a race in chains and to also end a rebellion, a tyranny. That's what he called the Confederacy. So the first Memorial Day is actually called Decoration Day because you were going to go and decorate the graves of the soldiers, was really specifically a Union holiday and meant to honor the memory of the men, mostly men, who died fighting to end slavery, because that's what the Civil War had certainly become. Even if people didn't think that's what it was about when it began, it certainly was, but that's what it clearly was. And when Abraham Lincoln gives the Gettysburg Address, in 1863, he makes it very clear that that's what this war is about.
Sure.
To ensure the promise of the Declaration of Independence. And so you cannot separate this holiday from its roots as the crusade to end slavery, this horrific stain on this country's history. You can't separate this holiday from that past. Now, what's interesting is that as time went by, through the late 1860s, by the early turn of the 20th century, the reason for Memorial Day had been forgotten. 50 years had passed, and people were starting to already treat it as a summer picnic holiday. It was also not a federal national holiday. I have to make that very clear. This was something that was done by different states. So each state would declare May 30th the Decoration Day. Later, they started to call it Memorial Day because not everyone was going to decorate graves with fresh flowers. I should also point out that in the Southern Confederacy states, the former Confederacy, they did not honor this day because it was seen as a Union or Northern holiday, and they began to mark their own separate Confederate Memorial Days or Decorations Days. Some of them on Robert E. Lee's birthday, some of them on Jefferson Davis's birthday. So from the very beginning, this was a divisive, partisan holiday, even though it was dedicated to the remembrance of those who had died in service to their countries. Go ahead.
Well, let me just ask you. I mean, listen. When I'm interviewing you, you can just talk, and I'll say a word or two here. But if you want, I would. I'm always interested in kind of how Memorial Day evolved over different conflicts and how it related to different conflicts. And again, going back to your earlier point, I suppose to some extent it relates to those who are still living who might have lost someone. So now we can certainly look at the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, where many of the widows are in their 40s. Maybe there are many kids that are still not probably still, I think, in high school, if not younger. So how does Memorial Day evolve with war and conflict that America is involved with, from World War II to Korea to Vietnam to Iraq and Afghanistan and all of the other conflicts that we don't probably talk about nearly enough?
Really good. A great question, Pete. Wow, you asked such great questions. I was kind of starting to get at that, and let me back up because it's much older than that, than our recent wars.
Sure.
By the turn of the 20th century, the early 1900s, the Civil War was fading from memory, and Memorial Day had already become this family picnic holiday. Then World War I comes about. 1918, 100,000 soldiers, American soldiers, die in 1 year of fighting, about a year of fighting. The United States, the war had started in 1914. The United States didn't get involved in 1917 and really didn't send a large number of troops until 1918. And of course, we've talked about this in light of the fact that World War I was also the year of the Great Influenza. So a lot of those soldiers actually died of the flu, just to bring all this history together. What happened, though, was that America was certainly a more, I should say, a less divided country along those old Civil War lines. And so Memorial Day in 1919 became a day now to recognize that this was going to acknowledge all of the soldiers who died in all of America's wars, going back to the Revolution, the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, the Mexican War. There were many other wars besides the Civil War, and this was now recognition that this could be a holiday that we think about as an American Memorial Day, and that's what it began. It was 2 years later, in 1921, that they created the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, specifically to honor a soldier who died fighting in World War I, whose remains were unidentified. And so that soldier was entombed in the Tomb of the Unknowns, and it was opened to great ceremony in 1921. By the way, Arlington Cemetery, this extraordinarily sacred space. If you go to Washington, if you do all the sites, make time. It's really worth it to see this place. I've
been there a couple times. Yeah, absolutely. A really good point. By the way, did America come up with the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier? Was that like other nations' past history probably had come up with that over and over?
I believe both the British and the French had such a thing. All so right. Yes, that was clear. But just another point to the divisiveness of the Civil War and the connections to Memorial Day. Arlington Cemetery, if you visited there, you would know this, was created out of land that was confiscated from the family of Robert E. Lee.
Right.
And his home is in the middle of Arlington Cemetery. And, during the Civil War, Lincoln would be in the White House and look across the river towards Arlington, and he'd see Confederate flags flying. So this land was confiscated during the war. And one of the generals in the Union, whose son had died, thought it would be fitting to turn Robert E. Lee's property into a cemetery. Really kind of tremendously ironic, but powerful statement. So that is once again the connection. And early in the celebrations of Decoration Day or Memorial Day, they would actually set up guards at Arlington to keep any Confederate families out of the cemetery that day, because there are a few Confederate soldiers buried there. There are also unidentified what were called USCT, U.S. colored troops.
Oh, wow.
They are also in Arlington, mostly unidentified. But yes, the Tomb of the Unknowns was a European idea, and then was recreated here. As we had future wars, a soldier from World War II, a soldier from the Korean War were also entombed in the Tomb of the Unknowns. Eventually, a soldier from Vietnam was placed there, but he was eventually identified. And because the DNA technology became more sophisticated, they were able to identify that soldier.
That's interesting.
And his remains were eventually returned. I believe he's in the National Cemetery in St. Louis now. So this speaks to your question. As we went through a series of other wars, Memorial Day changed. Decoration Day eventually came. Memorial Day finally becomes a national holiday and is moved to the last Monday in May, away from the traditional date of May 30th, creating another 3-day weekend when we had this Uniform Holidays Act. A lot of people feel that might have lessened the holiday. I don't think so. I think it's always been a seen as a weekend getaway kind of holiday. But one more important point, and this was very true for me as I was growing up, during the Vietnam era, Memorial Day kind of lost some of its widespread appeal. It was not the honored day it had been in the past because of the unpopularity of the Vietnam War. And I'm talking about the late 60s into the early 70s. And it was a long time. And Vietnam vets, probably some in your audience, will tell you that they did not get the reception, and the losses in Vietnam did not get the honor that they deserved, because those guys didn't choose to go there for the most part. Many volunteers, but most draftees. Those people felt like Memorial Day didn't really apply to them. And it was only, I think, as late as the Gulf War era that Vietnam veterans began to be much more appreciated. And of course, the creation of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, which is absolutely one of the most stunning places in Washington, D.C. I never fail to go when I'm in Washington. You go to the Lincoln Monument, the memorial, you read his words, read the words of the Gettysburg Address, and then you walk down to this, pit in our soul of this scar that's been carved into the earth there. It is absolutely one of the most moving, emotional places in Washington, D.C., as far as I'm concerned.
I second that entirely. I took my wife and daughters there, and it was very impactful, profoundly impactful.
So just to quickly finish up on this point, I think that it took a long time for the Vietnam era vets to get the recognition and the honor they deserve, and certainly the loss of those 58,000 plus lives in Vietnam. So that's why the holiday has become, I think, much more significant as a national holiday, but people still, for the most part, don't truly understand its meaning.
How then, getting back to the question, has it evolved for different generations? How is it different for the Iraq and Afghanistan, families? Because again, they grew up with me. And there are all kinds of Memorial Day traditions that probably a lot of us had that had nothing to do with the meaning of Memorial Day. And that's why we identify with them. How else did that change with different generations?
That's a good question. This is probably a point I should go back to the history of World War I and mention that's where the poppy comes from.
Yeah.
During World War I, a Canadian doctor who was in the army was serving in Belgium, France. And he goes to this very, very famous battlefield where they'd gone back and forth for years, called Flanders. And he sees a burial ground, and his friends are there. And he writes this poem that begins, "In Flanders fields, the poppies blow, between the crosses, row by row." Really, it's a wonderful poem. It's a very, very elegiac poem. He also later died, the man who wrote the poem. A young American woman
in the war.
This poem. He died in the war, during the war. I'm not sure if he died of illness rather than being wounded, because he was a medical doctor. So I don't think he was a battlefield casualty, probably an illness casualty, although I'm not sure. I don't think he was a victim of the influenza that killed a lot of soldiers, by the way.
You wrote a whole book about it.
This young woman in America knows this poem. It's a very well-known poem published around the world. And she decides that the poppy, this blood red flower with the dark center, is the perfect symbol of loss and remembrance. And she starts a movement called the Poppy Movement to sell flowers to raise money for the widows and orphans of the men lost in World War I. And so that's how the poppy becomes a symbol then of loss and remembrance. And it's very true in England as well. And I think in the 2018, they celebrate their Remembrance Day on the day that we call Veterans Day, November 11th, the day that the war ended in Europe in 1918. And England was covered in poppies because of this. So that's where the poppy comes from as the symbol.
And you were also going to say about, go back to May 30th, the significance.
Yeah, the May 30th date, it's interesting. It didn't really have any special meaning in terms of a date. It turns out that it was chosen because it was the day that the most flowers are in bloom in the northern states. So there would be plenty of flowers to take out to the cemetery. And it was a kind of arbitrary choice. And then later, as I said, when I was a kid, we always celebrated on May 30th. In 1968, they introduced what they call the Uniform Holidays Act, and that changed it to a 3-day Monday holiday. But the real problem with the fact that it's a holiday and it is the summer is that people don't understand this very deep history. And back to your question about how different eras have seen it.
Yeah.
One thing I would say for sure is that my father's generation, my father's war, World War II, my uncles were in Korea. These were wars that were fought by many more people than became typically true. That changed because of Vietnam. When we moved from a draft,
right,
And many more people were affected by going to war and going into the military. The transition to an all-volunteer army, which came about during Vietnam, I think changed perhaps some of the public attitudes towards military service. Vietnam also put a kind of a damper on that. So what was for me and my generation growing up, seeing our fathers, our uncles, my wife's father was also a World War II vet. This was, it was a much more personal thing.
Right.
Vietnam sort of changed our attitudes about the military in some ways. And then the volunteer army changed the general public's view. Very, very few Americans at this time know anybody personally
right.
who's in the service.
Right.
Very, very few. I mean, it's like 1% of the general population. So we have these kind of, oh, thank a vet, or thank you for your service at the airport if we see somebody in uniform. But it doesn't have the visceral effect that World War II and Vietnam had with, much greater numbers of loss.
Right.
But that certainly doesn't change. Every loss is a loss. And for all of those families, this is a day we should set aside to think about them.
No, but what you're saying is that when there's not as much loss or there's disproportionate loss, then certainly traditions and celebrations of life or loss, like Memorial Day, are just less. You're less attentive to them. They are defined or completely undefined or redefined in terms of a sale, or, as I said earlier, a sporting, event, or any number of things that people have redefined it to mean, right?
Yeah, completely. But you'll still see, and again, being perhaps in New York or maybe a large city, any other large city, you don't have the sense that I know exists in smaller communities where the graveyard cemetery is celebration or ceremony, not celebration. The ceremonies still go on. I used to live and be very often in a small town in Vermont at this time of year, and every year they had a small parade. I'm talking about a few dozen people led by a World War II veteran who would march to the little graveyard in this town where there were Revolutionary War veterans still buried. And so they marked it. So I think in a lot of small towns, you still have a little bit more of that feeling, that small town America feeling that connects to that
no doubt
very old history. And then the other thing is that in a lot of the national cemeteries, the national cemeteries that are designated for veterans, the Boy Scouts, I know it happens in Arlington, the Army actually goes out and puts a flag on every grave in Arlington. They start a few days early to get to them all. It's called Flags In. And it's, again, very moving when you go and see all of those flags. And this happens at other cemeteries. And so I think you see that in small towns and other communities that we don't necessarily feel in the bustle of a big city.
Right.
Here in New York, it's typically, they have Fleet Week. You and I got together by the Intrepid once upon a time, and all the sailors and Marines are in town.
I'll re-release that segment. It's one of the things that I did at CNN that I was most proud of, and I basically went down to the Hudson where Fleet Week occurs. All the big ships are in, and there's a whole bunch of veterans there. And what I did, folks, was I interviewed veterans who were just there and commemorating, and I brought or invited Professor Davis to come down there with me and give us a history lesson. Of course, they chopped the shit out of it because it's CNN, but it's a couple minutes with he and I, at least, I think, and it's a great lesson, and it's always relevant, and so I'll put it back out there, even though I don't have a beard and look like a naked mole rat. So I interrupted you just to mention that I'll reshare it because I'm really proud of it. But where were we? It
was a memorable time, and I know that at Fleet Week it concludes on Memorial Day, and they put a wreath in the water off the Intrepid, but that it's a nice gesture, and it doesn't have quite the intensity, I think, that going to a cemetery and seeing one of these ceremonies has. The Congress asks us to do one thing on Monday, Memorial Day, which is at 3:00, I presume local time, a moment of silence. I always suggest the very simplest thing to do, and it's a good thing to do anytime, but on Memorial Day in particular, read Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. 200 words plus words, takes about 2.5 minutes to read. That's how long it took Lincoln to recite it. It says everything there is to say about this holiday and what it should mean, and talks about the reason these soldiers died at Gettysburg when he dedicates that cemetery in November 1863. And it is, I think, the most perfect explanation of what we should be thinking about and honoring on this very, very important and solemn day.
Well, maybe a good place to end. I'd love to hear anything else. One last point, if you want to make it, or we can end there. I just set an alarm as you were talking in my phone to alert me of that moment of silence on Monday. Let's see. We'll see if I adhere to it or if the alarm goes off. But anything else, Ken, before I let you go? I've taken up so much of your time, and I so appreciate it.
No, I love to talk about this stuff. It's really important to understand this history, to understand its connection to our present, because that's the real reason I like to talk about history. Is not to know the dates and the battles and the speeches, but to understand how the past created the present that we are in, and what lessons we should have learned and usually don't from the past. There's more about Memorial Day on my website right now, don'tknowmuch.com. You can go there and find a little bit more about the history and some of the traditions that we've been talking about here today. You'll also find out that I have a new book coming out next November called Great Short Books, and a little bit of a departure from my recent work, but I'm very excited about that.
And I am very excited about that. I'm always excited about you. I should have said this at the top. I'll say it here at the end. Happy birthday. The 21st of May, if you want to put it in your calendar for next year, is when young baby, little tiny baby, Kenny, they could probably called you Kenny or something, came into the world. And we are so happy that he did, because people constantly tell me, when they name their favorite guests on the show, or the shows that they never miss, I pump them out every day, that they never miss my conversation with you. And so we celebrate you as well. Thank you so much for joining me. Happy birthday. And I will talk to you soon, sir.
Thank you, Pete. My father called me by my initials, which are KC. So I was Casey.
Wow.
To my veteran father. But nobody else called me that.
Well, and that's about to change, sir.
And it's really always been a pleasure to talk to you, Pete. I know we have fun talking about history. This day is not fun. I always struggle. What do you say? You don't say Happy Memorial Day.
Yeah.
But I guess I just hope people will take the time to learn a little bit more about it, learn about the traditions. And as I said, you can do worse than read Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. So thank you, my friend. Always a pleasure. And we'll talk down the road, because not far off is Juneteenth and the 4th of July.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I was going to say, what's next? I look forward to the next time. Thank you.
Thank you, Pete.
All right, there he goes. Kenneth C. Davis, don'tknowmuch.com. Check that out. Follow him on Twitter. Let him know that you heard him here. And I also, Phil Klay. Give it up for Phil Klay. I don't know why I keep saying give it up on today's show. Uncertain Ground is the name of his book. Check that out. Klay is Klay, by the way. And that's all I've got for you on today's show. I look forward to seeing you tonight. If you're a stand-up subscriber, check us out. If not, then sign up now, standupwithpete.com, standupwithpete.com, and join us. Thank you to all new subscribers. Hope to see you tonight at our hangout. You'll get the email with the link. If you don't, email me, standupwithpete@gmail.com, and I'll try to get it to you. All right. Be the change you want to see in the world. It's all we can do. I'll talk to you tomorrow.
Boy, you better stand up. Stand up. Well, there's a whole lot more of us who know what's right. They'll keep right on ignoring us if we keep sitting tight. You got to open up the window to let in some light. You got to stand up. That's right. You got to rise up. You got to to stand up. You gotta stare the devil straight in the eye. We got to let him know it's his turn to go. See it clear when all you hear is a lie. Don't get up off of your butt, get down off of your fence. Even if it ain't a very friendly audience, well, they'll begin to listen when you start making sense. And you stand up, stand up. No need to point your rifle to defend your town. Just stand up, stand up. You know they can't deny you what you're laying down. Boy, you better stand up, stand up. Show your face of every color, yellow, black, red, and brown. She's the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up, stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up, they had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of a stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We gotta let him know it's his time to go, and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. All right, we got to speak up. We got to reach up and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up. You got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up and show obedience to the voice inside. And listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand up, stand up. Got to stand up. Ooh, come on, just stand up. Everybody got to stand up in the darkest hour. Stand up, people got the power. Stand up. Come on, come on, come on. Come on, come on, come on. Come on, come on, come on.